Okay. Sam, I guess we can start?
Yeah, you can start, yeah.
All right, so you want me to start?
Yeah, of course. Ambassador Hill is always...
Okay. Well, let me welcome you all here. I think people are still coming into the room, but it's a really great crowd, and I have to compliment the Zoom technology for not crashing as we've gone over 100 people and continue to increase. So this is a joint production of the Global Engagement Office, but also the US-China Relations Center. The China Center at Korbel is a center with a sort of international reputation, really, very successful. At some point, I'll ask Professor Zhao to hold up his award-winning journal on contemporary China. I know it's a shameless way to do it, but if you do hold it up so other people could see it, that would be great. So we are going to discuss kind of where the US-China relationship is these days. And as the second part, we'll answer the first part, that is the relationship is really in a tailspin at this point. And the question is how it can be brought up in the coming months and years. I mean, whether the US likes it or not, or whether the Chinese like it or not, we're both going to be around for a while, and I think it behooves the two countries to figure out if we can go forward in some way, and perhaps from the U.S. vantage point, with some change in some issues about China. So we'll, I think, get into all of that. At this point, I'm going to ask Dr. Zhao for a few minutes introduction, but maybe then we'll go to the work study in our office, Katie, to maybe explain how Q's and A's will work and how we'll manage all this.
Okay, let me join Ambassador Hill to welcome everyone. As Ambassador Hill mentioned, that there's a joint program between the Center for China-US Cooperation at the Joseph Korbel School and the Office of Global Engagement headed by Ambassador Hill. In fact, Ambassador Hill is a very well-known figure in the field of China studies and US-China relations. When we met this announcement through social media, my photo parallel with Ambassador Hill, all those friends from China said, wow, you could parallel with Ambassador Hill? I feel so humbled in that case because Ambassador Hill is an internationally known figure. In fact, at DU, the only international figure that has that influence. So we are so honored to have this joint event together. I think now let's go to Katie, which is Global Engagement Office work study students to give a ground role. Then we can start our program.
Yeah, absolutely. So the best ways that people can ask questions, and we are more than welcome to help you guys answer any questions that you have. If you'd like to speak, there's a raise your hand function. So everyone should see a little icon that says participants at the bottom of your screen. If you click on participants, it should give you a little button that says you can raise your hand, and we can certainly call on you that way. You'll be able to unmute yourself and then ask a question to Professor Zhao or Ambassador Hill directly. If you prefer not to speak, there's also the chat function. So that's also on that bottom bar. You can press chat and then send a message to everyone, and we can try to go through as many of those as we can in the time that we have.
So Katie, we're going to rely on you to kind of monitor questions coming in on that chat function. But there's still a third way, isn't there? That is, if you can't figure out the chat function and you can't figure out the electric hand function, there's always the option of just raising your hand, and you'll scan the sort of pictures of people and hopefully catch that as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
Ask a question. So.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be able to get every question answered.
Okay, well, I think with those introductions, we can start. I think Professor Zhao, I'll sort of start with a few minutes.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
and we'll have a little conversation for a bit about this. And
Yeah,
then,
after this, you make your presentation about 10 or 15 minutes or whatever. Then I will just follow up from there. Then we can have a little bit of conversation. Then we can open up to the floor.
well, I think we are in a crucial and difficult period of US-China relations. To be sure, whenever America has an election, and those of you who are not aware of that, we are having one in November. Whenever there's a national election in the US, a four-year election, we find that the US-China relationship perhaps doesn't do so well. And I would argue, however, that there's something kind of different about it this time. And on an order of magnitude, the relationship is going into an even more difficult time during these elections. So I think the question will be, where will it go from here? But I think before we try to address that question of where these relations will go and how can we improve them, I think we ought to go into, in some way, how they got so bad. And basically, you can almost start anywhere because the relations with between the U.S. and China have deteriorated considerably. There is the longer-term issue where China has run up a huge trade surplus with the U.S. This is not unlike other East Asian countries, namely Japan in the 1980s, ran up enormous surpluses with the U.S. and then began to buy some U.S. assets, such as the Rockefeller Center in New York City. These were kind of traumatic moments for the U.S. as it saw this rise of, at the time, called Japan Inc. But we're seeing something like that now. But what we're seeing in China, though, is the fact that China has risen at, as I wrote in an op-ed a couple of weeks ago, has risen at a time when, at a very inconvenient time, because China is I think the symbol of American job loss. Never mind that many of the jobs lost in the U.S. economy have been to automation. There are estimates of upwards of 60% of job loss is caused by automation. But I think China has become the symbol of why people have found that their jobs either no longer exist or that the industries where they've been working are much smaller than they were before. In addition, there is a sense, I think, among many Americans, and this is not just among blue-collar Americans who have felt very directly this job loss, but there's certainly a sense among many Americans that somehow China has benefited tremendously from a system that opened itself up to China, that welcomed China to be as Bob Zoellick said during the Bush administration, a responsible stakeholder, and that somehow China has abused this or somehow not played by the rules while it expected others to play by rules in dealing with China. So I think there's a sense that China is taking advantage of openings that were granted to China on the basis that China would change and become a real part of the system, and that somehow China has abused this. I think in addition, and what makes the China situation different from the 1980s and the Japan situation, was China is simply enormous. It's in population, some 3, almost 4 times larger than the U.S. It's got an enormous continental country that also has very important maritime interests and a very expanding military. Now, for Americans who worry about the size of the U.S. military relative to China, our military is frankly second to none in the quality and the capacities to be engaged in whatever we need to be engaged in. But we've seen China continue to grow and to devote double-digit increases every year, budgetary increases. And so we see a military capacity that is expanding every year. And that too is very different from what was going on in Japan. In fact, when Americans look at Japan, there's a sense that Japan should do more in terms of its capacity, where China's, I think, a great concern that it's doing too much. And in addition, I think there was an expectation over the years that there'd be some kind of convergence. China would be somehow, in some way, more like us in terms of uh, being a more liberal society. And that is certainly true in some respects. That is, China has its own sort of environmental movements, which are, in China's case, kind of proto-political parties. Maybe we'll have some time to talk about that. But generally speaking, there's a perception that China has gone back toward more central control. So overall, these things have not added up to a very positive relationship of late. And in particular, there have been a number of hotspots that for which there's a concern that China has sort of helped to make those places more dangerous. For example, the U.S. Worked with China. In fact, I personally worked with China on the North Korean question. The Chinese in the U.S. really developed some patterns of cooperation, but in the meantime, the North Koreans have pulled back from it, and we don't see a real effort from the Chinese to really get things back on track. There seems to be a sense among Chinese leadership that somehow this is for the U.S. To figure out that China can't really do more than what it's been doing. So just as the U.S. may exaggerate China's ability to solve the North Korean question, the Chinese certainly sort of underestimate its capacities to improve the situation. So sort of in regional terms, North Korea is not going well at all, and probably going in the wrong direction. In addition, in the South China Sea, China has continued not only to have a policy of the so-called nine-dash line, where it kind of claims the South China Sea as its historical territory, but has actually not only been putting facts on the ground, they've actually been making the ground itself with the creation of various military bases in that part of the world. And so interestingly, from say 15 years ago, when I was working on these issues, where we had Southeast Asian nations very interested in improving their relations with China, China's relations with some of its Southeast Asian neighbors have not gone well, and in fact have been worsening. And again, there's a sense that China is making kind of unilateral decisions and not really working these things through mechanisms that exist for these types of disputes. Moreover, China has not typically tried to work with the ASEAN countries, but rather picking each ASEAN country off on its own. So there's a kind of frustration that China has not allowed for the growth of regional institutions in the region, preferring to keep everyone very much atomized without being able to leverage their position. So all of this came to a head, I think, during the Trump administration, when President Trump made very clear that he was not going to put up with more Chinese, with more of China's trade policies. And he has really kind of pushed back with China. One can argue about how he's done that, whether this was the best way to deal with it. But in any event, I think it's clear that those trade talks, after several rounds of them, although there's a deal on the table, it has come at considerable cost in the sort of capacity of the two countries to work together. And then most recently, of course, is the pandemic. The Trump administration's efforts to kind of put the finger on China and explain that China should have done much more to alert the rest of the world. China has not been willing to accept that kind of criticism, and we've seen the relationship get even worse as a result of this pandemic. One hopes that there's a sort of silver lining to these kinds of worldwide crises, that something like a pandemic would bring people together in a sense that we're all in this together, and we have to, work to get a vaccination. research going. But in fact, this pandemic has driven the US and China further apart. In the meantime, I think China has been very worried about the fact that many countries looking at their medical devices at home and whether they've got the kind of supply chain necessary to protect their populations are now looking to shorten their supply chain and find ways closer to home that they can deal with these things. And this is beginning to worry the Chinese and their access to markets and their capacity to hold on to market share. And so we've seen China trying to reach out and provide personal protection equipment, PPE, to many, many different countries to do it at very low cost. China paid some price in the form of the fact that much of its PPE, there are many examples where the quality was not up to what people were expecting. So there were problems like that. But interestingly, China has been accused that somehow, since it has reached the right side of this curve in terms of COVID infections, that it's done well to get through this, albeit with draconian efforts, that China is now trying to sort of leverage its position as a post-pandemic country and somehow gain even more influence. Finally, I would just say, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of the capacity of the two countries to talk to each other except through press conferences, which, by the way, in diplomacy is never a good way to discuss things, sensitive issues, we've seen a real diminution in the quality of our ability to talk to the Chinese and their ability to talk to us. It was the last time Secretary Pompeo visited China was in October 2018. He got into a major shouting match with the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he has not been back since. And the idea that you can go almost 2 years without a U.S. Secretary of State visiting China is quite remarkable, and speaks to the kind of degradation of the quality of the dialogue that we're having with China. So with that kind of scene setter on where we are, I guess what we ought to think about is at least we should stop, when you get into a hole, the first thing you do is stop digging. And then the next thing you do is figure out how to get out of that hole. And I think we should devote some attention to precisely that issue. Professor?
Okay, let me join Ambassador Hill. He has given a very complete review of the developments in the recent years. In fact, when I talked to Ambassador Hill about this event, we thought about what topic would have. Then we came out a topic, US-China, how we can find a way back. That was the topic we came out at first. Then we talked about can we go back to the good old days. Then we agreed that we cannot go back. Nobody wants to go back at this time. So let me start from the point why we cannot go back. Where was the good old days? In fact, the good old days was based upon a grand bargain between these two countries. On the US side, US thought they could open China and make China more like America, to bring China to the international community. Then China would become democratic, if economically also free market. Everything the US would want to have, then they could work with China. In fact, for that purpose, US has opened up its market and also its investments and technology, everything for China to develop. On the China side, the bargain was China wanted at that time after Cultural Revolution to join the world, to use the international market, especially the American US market, technology and investments, everything to develop. But from China side is that we will develop, we will become strong, powerful, and prosper. But carbon knowledge. That's the fundamental bargain China side had. So there was a kind of mismatched bargain on these two sides to start their honeymoon, their good old days to work together. But eventually, I think in last decades, both sides have discovered that they cannot no longer live on those bargains because the US side quickly discovered, not quickly, Tiananmen Square in 1989, then 2008, 2009, the financial meltdown, everything. They find China has not become what the US wanted China to become. And maybe China will never become what US wanted China to become. So US in that case has rethink its relationship with China. Basically, in the past, US policy was engagement, to engage China. Now the people then said engagement failed. And we have to find new ways to work with China. So on the China side, China also developed in this process, become the second largest economy in the world. And China became very nervous also about the US intention to change China. And the Chinese Communist Party, especially since President Xi Jinping came to office, has been very, very firm. We cannot move toward the direction that US wanted us to move. We want to make clear that, very, very firm, that the Communist Party control cannot be threatened. The Soviet Union, he came to office, warned the party that the collapse of Soviet Union can never happen in China. So the external threats, including the American threats, they call peaceful revolution, become an issue for China. And also China, in that process, become more powerful. So they thought they have the ability to confront the United States. So they would, in the past, they accommodate everything Americans wanted to do. Now they said, no, we cannot accommodate unless you respect our core national interests. What is called national interests? It's a kind of bottom line of a national survival. We cannot compromise. You cannot even negotiate. That's the job of the military, not the diplomats like Ambassador Hill would resolve. In fact, I sometimes joke to them, if everything is called national interest, cannot negotiate, why you want to have a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? The Ministry of Defense should be sufficient to fight. But that's the mentality gradually coming to the mind of many Chinese elites and leaders. So in this kind of situation, the relationship has changed. Neither side has that kind of illusion to the other side, and neither side is willing to compromise to the other side demands. So that's brought us to the current situation. What is the current situation? I think there are several aspects are very clear to me that is very different from the past. One is that in the past, we had crisis. We had confrontation and conflicts, but that was caused by a single event. For example, the mid-air collision, which Ambassador Hill dealt with, and the embassy bombing. And those single events caused crisis. So we can have a crisis management on both sides. And in fact, at that time, both sides wanted to resolve those crises quickly to move on. So we see cycles in the relationship, up, down, and their crisis, resolve that, moving up. And then we have a problem, we resolve that. That problem brings down the relationship, but come back. But current situation is very different. It's not a single event caused this current, I think, pronounced crisis. In fact, the crisis even started before the Trump administration came to office. Lambden had a speech in Carter Center, I think 2005. He used the term tipping point. The relationship at that time was already in a tipping point. So this crisis has been known and not caused by single event, caused by many, many events, many, many problems. In fact, looking at today, what is the primary issue between these two countries? Is that a trade deficit? Is that Taiwan issue? Is that Hong Kong issue? Is that South China Sea issue? Is that pandemic issue? All the issues are intertwined, connected. So many problems, we have to find solutions, and even find one problem for one solution, the other one will come up. I mean, Trump tweet this morning, I thought COVID-19, I forgot it because now there are so many other issues coming up. So many issues simultaneously confront leaderships on the both sides. So that's very different from past. Second, very different is that in the past, we saw on both sides, a lot of people try to save the relationship. But now I see many people on the both sides try to dump the relationship. That's the so-called hawkish people have been prevailed in the both sides, especially domestic politics. Ambassador Hill mentioned that election, for example, is a good part of these kind of things. Domestic politics has been a very powerful force to affect the relationship. On both sides, the pandemic crisis is a very good example. Both sides try to use the other side as a scapegoat. And China side blamed the US military to bring the virus to China because at first the Chinese government really mishandled the problem. And Xi Jinping was under heavy pressure for the transparency and accountability. And when they controlled the pandemic on the China side, the virus, they try to find foreigners to divert the attention. So US and Italy, all those kind of countries become targets to divert the domestic tension, which worked very well, I think, in the China case. In the US case, also Trump has used China. Now I think election central for my whole life, I've never seen China issue has been so prominent in American election. In the past, I went to China talking to my friends in China. They also, oh, Americans use China. I said, Americans have had too many problems, Russia, Middle East, every other issues in the international front. Now, China is the single most important scapegoat for all the problems US has, as Ambassador Hill mentioned that even the automation produced unemployment is China's fault. And all the problems, even his delayed response to the virus, everything is China's fault. So domestic politics, domestic issues has been so prominent to affect the relationship between these two countries. Third aspect, I think Ambassador Hill already talked about communication between these countries. In the past, when Ambassador Hill was in the US government, they had so many communication, institutionalized communication channels, strategic dialogue, economic dialogue. At if each cabinet level, they have all those, I heard there are over 100 communication channels try to talk to each other if there was a problem. But now I don't see any of those channels working at all. In fact, Ambassador Hill mentioned that Secretary of State Pompeo, since 2008, October, 2 years, have not been in China. Not only he has not been in China, he's not talked. Ambassador Hill, in fact, when we were in China that year, US embassy person came to our hotel, talked to you that you told us that Pompeo was lectured by his counterpart, Wang Yi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, because Vice President Michael Pence had a speech in Harvard Institute, which was seen by China side as a declaration of the new Cold War. So China was very angry at the US. He gave a long lecture to Pompeo. Since then, he has not only not been in China, he has not talked to Wang Yi. He's talking only to Yang Jiechi, the state counselor, who is in charge of the foreign affairs. And in those talks, you can see those news publications, they talk over each other. Really did not really had negotiation on anything, just criticize so the channel has been totally gone. And not only communications has been very effective this time, the basic connections between these two countries are going to be cut, so-called decoupling. That is now a very hot topic between these two countries. Even Chinese students who want to get visa to study in the US are having problems. And last couple of days, you can see they want to cut all the visas for the Chinese students studying science, technology related from their perspective to the Chinese military universities. So the basic communication channel has been cut. That will produce a lot of misperceptions and also misjudgment on the both sides. Only thought by the other side, bad, evil intention. That's the problem. The fourth problem, I think, this issue is that now the conflicts is no longer on the policy level; it's a power level. That's what people talk about. This is trap, rising power versus so-called incumbent power. So it's who is number one, who is going to dominate the world, who is to lead the world, who's a shape is going to shape the global order. So that's a very, very difficult problem to find compromise on the two sides. So the relationship in recent years have been changed completely. Then what caused these changes? There are a lot of problems here. I don't want to get into them because we can talk them on the Q&A or conversation. But I just want to mention one point. That is the US-China side has to be overplayed its hand, overconfident. They will regret in the long run. The US has been overreacted to the China's threat, and the US has been too inconfident. China is overconfident. US has been less confident, underestimated its power because of Trump. I think that's a problem on this side. And the way out, let me very briefly mention that. That's what the topic we came out, the right track. Instead of go back, we can no longer go back. So I don't know if we can now find the right track. That's a problem of today because of the key problem here is leadership. On both sides, I don't think there is a very clear vision on the leaders of both sides to find ways to work together. So in that context, we can only rely on the forces, work them out. What are the forces? I think there are several forces I think we can look for. Economic forces. What kind of interdependence between these two countries will work out? The decoupling part is that we can just cut from each other. We don't have to work together. Is that what kind of cost we have to pay for those kind of decoupling? And how if interdependence could help these countries to soften the problems? The second force, I think, is that do we have an international environment for the new Cold War? In other words, the Cold War is bipolar world. Clearly, every country had to make a choice between the US and China. I don't know if that's the case. Every country is willing to make choice between the US and China. Most countries have tried to avoid those choices. Even the Hong Kong case, yesterday I read the statement by US, Australia, UK, and Canada, the four countries. I was thinking, why Germany? Why French? Those countries did not sign up. Why even Japan did not sign up? Because they really don't want to make choice between these two countries. So there are some other forces I think we can talk about. Another force is both sides domestically. China, I think, is still big beneficiary of US net international order. I don't think it's in China's interest to start a confrontation with the United States. On the US side, I don't know if these two countries, US would be able to pay for the price. Finally, I think the force is so-called those shared interests, global issues, climate change, the pandemic, for example, and the weapons of mass destruction. All those issues have to be worked out with collaboration between these two countries. So if these two countries, these forces would come up for these two countries to work together. So those are the forces I think I will look at. So I'll stop here. I can ask some questions for Ambassador Hill, then we can have a conversation. Is that how we can do?
We can go that route. I'd just like to say that I think the way back to better relations is in a route that leads forward. I agree with that. And I think perhaps there ought to be an effort to look at things that we have been doing with each other that are not sustainable. It is not sustainable for China to run these surpluses with any country, and certainly not us. And so it's true that a lot of it has to do with automation, but it's equally true that China should understand that and should understand that inevitably to try to raise market share in a period where people are going through economic transformation, transition that's very painful to people, that inevitably China would get the blame or most of the blame for these kinds of changes. So I think China needs to look at the markets from the point of view as an environmentalist looks at sustainability and say, well, can we really sustain this? Or do we have to do more on domestic demand, or do we have to find different markets? So I think China needs to do some of that. I think the US has got to be a little more careful about speaking to a sort of Chinese sense of strategic paranoia. If we go back to the Shanghai Accord back 40, 50, where are we now? 50 years ago.
Shanghai Communique, yes.
Okay, we can see that what was going on at the time was an effort by the US to try to make sure the Sino-Soviet axis was broken. But at the same time, China had an interest in making sure they didn't have a Soviet encirclement against them. So ironically, we had different objectives, but they resulted in a common interest. China did not want Russia teaming up with Vietnam and other places to kind of create strength around it. At the same time, the US wanted to make sure that we didn't have this Chinese strategic alliance with Russia. Kind of ironic that we ended up in a situation where we improved our relationships. So right now, I think some of this is replaying itself. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific region, is there really such a thing? I mean, has India really had a strategic reach into East Asia? Really, it hasn't. It's kind of a new concept. It's certainly flattering to India that it could have such a strategic reach, but I think we need to be kind of careful that it doesn't look like we are somehow encouraging this very large democracy, India, to kind of play a role in some sort of strategy that is designed to hold down China. So I think at a very fundamental level, we need to have some serious conversation about this. I think as well, China has a history. I mean, 2,000 years, 4,000 years certainly constitutes a history. For Americans, history is just last Tuesday, but for other countries, it goes back a while. And so China has a history of dealing with its neighbors in a different way from the way the Europeans have traditionally looked at neighbors, or the way the US is considered neighbors, and the whole concept of sovereignties that developed in Europe. China doesn't have that legacy, that historical legacy. China has a legacy of much smaller countries, all having a kind of relative tributary relationship to China. It's a very different sort of historical and even anthropological endowment that China has compared to us. There needs to be more discussion about that. There needs to be that. And then I would say, moving from these kind of cosmically large concepts, we need to find, I've said this a million times, and the reason I've said it a million times is I really believe it. We need to find some areas where we can work together on something. Usually third country issues are best because bilateral issues are often difficult because there's often a zero-sum mentality of dealing with bilateral issues. My favorite candidate was always North Korea, that somehow we do have some common interests there and we ought to be able to work together. That's proving a little more fraught than maybe it was a few years ago. It's proving very difficult, but we need to find some areas where the U.S. and China can do something together and kind of recreate a mood, if not a policy, where the two countries have an interest. Again, I think we need a kind of broad strategic dialogue about the fact that neither of us is going to subdue the other, and that there needs to be a real sort of look at what we can do together, because the current situation, I mean, this is not Coke and Pepsi looking for different markets. This is a much more difficult situation for two countries that I think have the capacity to be superpowers for years to come.
Yes, I think Ambassador Hill is right. Both sides have problems. China side, the trade deficit cannot sustain that way, and China has to make some adjustments. The trade wall, is that a solution? I don't know. In fact, so far I don't know how much the trade wall has accomplished, how much the manufacturer have come back to the U.S. And how much the deficit has been reduced. I don't know how much. Yesterday, in that conversation, Cobell School with Albright, she mentioned one point that I think was interesting. She said, we are in the 21st century, but trying to find 19th century, 18th, and 20th century solutions. In fact, bringing those manufacturers back to the US, I don't know if that's real solution are possible. We have to take advantage of the US high-tech, high end of the production chain, comparative advantage, all those things. So there are a lot of issues we can discuss on that side. One question here is that also history, Ambassador Hill mentioned that China relationship with its neighbors and other countries are very different from the US one. And China has not having any allies so far around its borders. And China had those kind of hierarchical, historical view in terms of relationship with other countries. China has not been socialized very well into modern statecraft. Very often they see the world in a hierarchical term, which is a big problem when they work with their neighbors and also with the United States, with other countries. So both sides have to learn to make some changes in order to improve the relationship. People say it's a conflict of civilizations, which I don't think that's the case, but there are conflict of cultures between these two countries, conflicts of interest. In that context, I want to ask Ambassador Hill one question, because Ambassador Hill was in the government so many years. If you were still in the State Department working on East Asian Bureau, what kind of policy recommendations you will make to the president about working on relationship with China?
Yeah, well, I would, my advice would stress the longevity of China, the fact that radical ideas that it will fall apart or somehow start wars are really not sustained by the available evidence. And we ought to kind of understand China for what it is. We should be modest in our expectations that we can change China. I think that's very important because I think too often people have looked to change their behavior. And at best, we can change the environment in which they behave. And the environment in which they behave is something that they can then decide, do we need to make changes in our behavior to do better in this environment? So I would really approach China from a kind of realistic point of view. I don't want to say realism because I know that triggers all kinds of academic warning bells and whistles, not to talk about realism. But I really think we need to kind of look realistically at what can be done. I would also stress to any incoming president that our relationship with China is something long term, and the most we can do in a given administration is put a few elements of the puzzle together with an expectation that we should see if we can gain a broader consensus within the U.S. of how to go forward. I think in the past we've done pretty well. We've had president after president essentially pursuing the same kinds of approaches to China. I think to some extent transformation in the world and some of these global issues just got ahead of us, and our politics could not sustain this kind of concept of consensus in an approach. But I think we need to get back to that because I think the long game is something we need to work on with China. People often talk about how China plays the long game and somehow we don't have the patience for that. Actually, I think we can handle it a lot better than we've done lately. And I think we've shown that we can have patience and we can work together on issues that are, of importance. So finally, as a sort of modus operandi needs to be constant communication with China. And I think, I was, my diplomatic training didn't come from school. It came from working with people like Richard Holbrooke. I can tell you that, if there were a problem with Wang Yi and Richard Holbrooke were the Secretary of State, he'd be right back at Wang Yi the next day. He'd be back at him the next week and the next week after that. There'd be this sort of constant effort to work closely and to make sure that we could really understand each other and avoid what is essentially situations where we've essentially set back our efforts. So I think it's very important to know people well in diplomacy and then make sure that they understand what you're looking for. And some areas you're going to have some disagreements. There's no way around that. But you should avoid areas where you just have misunderstandings. And if you can just get down to disagreements and not have misunderstandings, I think you've gotten part of the way there. And so I would want to see officials who don't mind taking long airplane trips and don't mind. By the way, with China, you have to be willing to say the same thing 30 times over because they'll do it 35 times over. So Americans, we always want to say something different. No, just say the same thing. Just show them that you can be just as persistent and stubborn as they can be, and don't always expect. They're not going to change on something, so why should we then sort of dance around and change as well? You've got to be kind of consistent on these things. And what I think really worries me of late is you get new administrations and they want to do things differently all the time. And in foreign policy, consistency and persistence is what wins the game.
Okay. I think the time's up for our conversation maybe will open up because I saw a lot of questions. Katie, do we have?
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions and a lot of great debate going on in the chat. First thing, I'd like to have Erin Slauson ask her question directly, and then we'll get right into the chat and get through as many of those as we can. So Erin, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, Ambassador Hill and Dr. Zhao, thank you so much for together. Graduated years ago from DU, and it's really nice to still be able to
Erin worked for China Center in the past.
Active member of the community. I wanted to ask both Ambassador Hill and Dr. Zhao about the prospects for the phase 1 trade agreement surviving till November and potentially, until phase 2. I know at the MPC, the Chinese last week said that they were still committed to the deal, but they have under-delivered on commitments, and President Trump seems to be hot and cold on it. So, and if the deal does get shredded, will there be any safe spaces left for cooperation between the U.S. and China? What will be left to keep the whole thing from blowing up?
Chris, you want to start? Or?
Sure. I think I think what's important in our conversation is maybe to try to stay away from American domestic politics, but and try to kind of stress some of the longer contours of the relationship and what needs to be done. But I do think in terms of this phase 1, I think the basic approach makes sense, and I think you could convince a follow-on administration, if there's a change of administration, to continue the basic approach. And I think the Chinese would be willing to do it if they saw a sort of consistency and a growing consensus within the country on this kind of approach. So, I think it requires some work, and it requires an administration, whether this one or one to follow, to really explain to people what we're doing and to try to get people to understand that this is a game plan, not a rant, not a sort of angry screed of, and if they don't do this, we'll hit them back with that. But that this is how we're approaching it, and try to make sure the Chinese understand that we'll be consistent on this and we'll stay with what's been agreed. And I think one of the problems we have, and to some extent it's the legacy of the current administration, but it's not only the current administration, is what I was talking about a few minutes ago. We have a tendency to, agree to something and then put a kind of different nuance on it when you have a next team. So fortunately in China, we've tried to keep these things consistent, but I think we're really having problems right now, and I hope we can get back on that track.
Erin, now you're working for the US-China Business Council, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, so I understand the question you come from. My understanding of the issue here is that from Chinese perspective, the phase 1 negotiation, China made a huge concession to the US. That's why President Trump could declare victory on the phase 1 agreement. But how to implement those terms has been very difficult. China agreed, for example, to purchase $200 billion agricultural products, which I don't think that was real from very beginning. And the pandemic really is even far from the real. This year, so far, last 4 months, China purchased only about $3 billion, far from what they promised because of so many problems on both sides. So here, some other concessions also are difficult. For example, China agreed to some opening of their insurance and financial sector, which had to be approved by the National People's Congress, which was postponed until this week. So a lot of issues here. For Trump, I think there were 3 solutions for him on this. First, to renegotiate. He talked about renegotiate, which I don't think that could be accomplished. Second is to simply suspend that, which I don't think that's realistic either. The third is to come back to reality, just see how much we can go, how far we can go. Then eventually we'll see we can move to phase 2, which I don't think phase 2 is anything near before the election, anything possible before election. So that will happen after election. So phase 1 trade deal is, I think, still alive. And just how we can accomplish, implement, I think that's the issue here.
Thank you.
I can go ahead and start reading some questions from the chat. There's a lot of great questions and great debate going on, and unfortunately we won't be able to address everything. But the first question is, Carl Blight said that the Chinese are not very good at diplomacy. Do you agree?
Whether they're good at not very good at diplomacy. Well, I must say I'm not impressed with the so-called wolf diplomacy that they're talking about. And I don't think China's problems in diplomacy have to do with a lack of vigor in supporting Chinese policies, which is what this wolf diplomacy suggests. So, but I must say, having worked with a very large Chinese team during the six-party talks, and when I say large, I mean we all had upwards of 25, 35 members of each delegation, except for the North Koreans. They had something more like 10. I was very impressed with the quality of Chinese diplomats. I was impressed with the drafting skills, because they put together these agreements. We'd have another day of negotiation, and they'd take a piece of something the North Koreans wanted, and something the Japanese wanted, and something we wanted, and kind of meld it into a document that made sense. That's a diplomatic. That's a skill. That's a skill. It's not easy to do. I was continually impressed with them, impressed with their language skills, their sort of stamina in going through this. I mean, we'd talk during the day and they'd write through the night in order to kind of have new drafts by the morning. So I think they're very good. But I think this latest stuff where they're supposed to be more aggressive on the stump, I don't think is helping their reputation. And frankly, I think they ought to rethink that stuff.
I think Ambassador here is correct. The Chinese diplomats used to be very no key, no profile, and courtesy, everything, try to find solutions. But I think they have changed in the last several years, because one thing China said, they have been much more powerful. They can no longer make a compromise or commendation to foreign countries. Second, here, the Chinese leadership has emphasized the fighting spirit. That's how the warrior diplomacy has come up, because if we are talking about fighting a war, which is not diplomacy. When you're fighting war is to win over enemies. Diplomacy is a give and take. You make some compromise, I make some compromise, then even we have some on the least table bargaining, that's a diplomacy. You are fighting, everything is on the table, and everything is lose or win. That makes the diplomacy totally changed, which I think that's the problem for China during the pandemic. You see those Chinese diplomats, they are so aggressive. They try to push back on any, what they say, stigmatization of the China, any criticism of China. They have to counter, they have to attack, they have to clarify. That's not the job of diplomats. So that has changed the nature of Chinese diplomacy.
Yeah, I don't think it's doing them any favors either. I think
your friend, Cui Tiankai, ambassador to the US, he's still good.
He was one of the people, the Chinese ambassador now in the US was one of the people at the six-party talks. And he worked very hard to try to get different positions on the same piece of paper. what you're often trying to do as a negotiation is get an agreement, usually on a piece of paper. And when you have the North Korean position, it's sometimes not easy to do. And I thought the Chinese were very effective at it. But I tell you, when this wolf stuff, this sort of screaming at you stuff, that is really not doing China any favors. And China is a problem right now. This type of stuff is contributing to the problem.
Great. The next question in the chat is, if China had followed the US model, I think that's referring to in terms of just development and political structure, would the US have chosen a different approach towards China now?
Let me jump this in. I don't think China would follow US model at all. In any case, doesn't matter what type of US policy for China is, because all the key issue, core issue for the Chinese diplomacy, Chinese development is to make sure the Communist Party stay in power. The one-party rule is the fundamental principle for the Chinese government. All the reforms, market or economic reform, or any other opening toward the world are conditioned that Communist Party is in power. So when Xi Jinping came to office, quite a people had some kind of illusion that he will be a reformer, everything, try to change China toward US, but that has not happened. In fact, he has consolidated his power. And in fact, China now not only will not follow the US path or model, China has tried to establish its own China model of political governance and the modernization, everything. Even during last week, the National People's Congress, Chinese leaders, Xi Jinping, in fact, he himself at the session meeting, he mentioned the democracy with Chinese characteristics, the Chinese style democracy. So China is building its own path and model, which is authoritarian, one-party role to compete now is with the United States. In fact, during this pandemic, you can see after April, in fact, late March, when China controlled the virus by very, very strong authoritarian method, China launched a big propaganda campaign to promote superiority of the Chinese political system. Those are very centralized whole nation, whole government approach to combat the virus. They thought it was much more effective. The American way, European way, they call kind of a Buddhist way, soft, cannot work. In the crisis, Chinese system, China's model has been so effective. So I don't, in fact, I talked to a lot of friends in China. They have been very elective to American model. They think America is a failure now. Even some people thought, oh, we want to learn from US for so many years ago. Now we find the real situation, US is a failed state. Unfortunately, that's their perception, which I don't know if I don't agree, but that's the perception in China, which is so unfortunate.
I spent the early part of my career in some of these communist societies, the People's Republic of Poland, the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. And when you look at some of the models we had for economics, it was pretty appalling. I mean, it was this kind of command economy where you would determine how many, how many baby carriages you needed, and they'd produce tons of baby carriages, and it was a disaster. And it's essentially what China had. And so China has switched to a concept that is much closer to us than it was to Stalin's concept of central planning. I mean, price is the intersection of supply and demand. But I think the Chinese have kind of pursued it in a way that, again, I can't stress enough, is just not going to be sustainable for the rest of us. and has got a little too much of sort of state cheerleading behind it, a kind of neo-mercantilism, if you can put it in some jargon. So I think China is going to have to kind of look at, you know, what kind of mixture of small and medium-sized industries they're going to have, and how are they going to use the financial sector, et cetera. They have a long way to go, but I think it's important to understand that they're a lot closer to us now than they were back in the 1950s, which was just in a totally other world. So, you know, I think, again, as I said earlier, we need to shape the environment so that a country like China is not able to kind of ram things down our throat using our own rules, or pretending to use our rules in order to do it. So that's another issue where we need to have some serious talks with them and not just yelling at each other through the media.
Great. Our next question is, Tom Friedman recently wrote an op-ed calling Mike Pompeo, quote, the worst Secretary of State ever, end quote. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has called Pompeo public enemy #1. How would you evaluate Pompeo's performance, especially regarding US-China relations? And if you were in his position, what would you do differently?
Ambassador Hill.
You know, the Chinese in the past have not tended to do that sort of thing, called out individual diplomats. That's really something you'd have to go back to the 1950s to see. You know, whether you like Pompeo or don't like Pompeo, I don't think it's for the Chinese to kind of rudely attack the American Secretary of State. Lord knows I have my concerns about Pompeo. I think China ought to think twice about doing that sort of thing. It's the sort of stuff that North Korea does morning, noon, and night. And I like to think of China as a country with a greater sense of sophistication than to attack some foreign diplomat. Maybe because I've been a foreign diplomat there, but I just don't think it's right for China to do that. As for what Pompeo should do, I don't know. Whenever someone brutally attacks me, I at least stop talking and listen a little, and I can learn something. But regardless of that, China shouldn't be doing this.
I agree with Ambassador Hill that that's a part of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. In fact, they called not only Secretary Pompeo as a public enemy #1, they have a long list of a public enemy #1 for American leaders. So that's totally wrong. But for the American foreign policy is in Pompeo's watch, I think there are some kind of problems, too ideological and basically not quite consistent, erratic, a lot of problems, which I think give the excuses for other countries and also even for allies, for UK, for French, for European countries have problems, even for Japan have problems to work with the United States. Ambassador Hill host an event with Swedish former Prime Minister. He talked about around Trump, there are not those many normal people. So from that perspective, I think U.S. diplomacy could be improved. Of course, for sure, these kind of attacks from a foreign country for American leaders, American officials are totally out of line.
Great. Our next question is, does the U.S. need to rethink its hegemonic diplomatic approach?
Ooh.
It's a big one.
Well, I don't like to think of the U.S. as having a hegemonic approach. I don't like the marketing of our foreign policy as America first, because it's kind of doesn't give room for anyone else. And as Professor Zhao was saying earlier, in diplomacy, there's a lot of give and take. And when you start with America first, it sounds like you're doing all the taking and not giving much giving. So I think it's a real, it's something that is bound to lead to America alone, and I don't think that's anything, any position that a diplomacy should have. So, but I don't like to think of us as hegemonic. I mean, you know, that's a very strong word, and I don't think it's a good description of U.S. foreign policy now, or frankly, ever.
Let me put my so-called scholar's hat there. There's a theory called the hegemonic stability theory, IR, in the national institute. Good provide only by hegemonic power. These kind of public goods you cannot include other people, free riders. So nobody wants to provide that. Only hegemonic power could provide that. So for many years, U.S. In that context as hegemonic power provided so many global leadership, a lot of global public goods. I think that's good. Which hegemonic the term hegemonic term, I will see that as a more neutral term instead of a type of negative. Chinese use that term as a totally negative term. U.S. is seeking hegemonic dominance in the world to impose American values, American system to the world. That's a different type. But as a most powerful nation in the world, U.S. should be able to take more leadership role. And for example, for the pandemic, if in good old days, U.S. would work with allies, multilateral international institutions, trying to find ways to deal with, to cope with the crisis. Now, U.S. totally gave up the global leadership. And the world is G0, no leader. That's a very, very dangerous. I don't think China now is able to fill the vacuum U.S. And China is not willing to pay for those public goods. So we are in a very dangerous situation of the world. No hegemonic responsibility, no international public goods, no, even the people use that term, a world policeman. U.S., some people said, oh, we don't want to be policemen. We don't want to run the world. Someone has to maintain order in the world. So U.S. Should play a role as a most powerful nation, but not America alone. America could work with China, with European countries, with Australia, with other countries to have a multilateral approach nowadays. Especially another issue here relating to the hegemonic issue is that for so many years, U.S. has been the only superpower. So China is rising, some other countries is rising. So U.S. have to learn how to work equally with emerging nations, emerging powers. That's another issue, talking about hegemonic power.
Well, I've been looking around for my academic hat. All I old baseball hat, so I won't put that on. But I think what is confusing, though, to many people about the U.S. foreign policy is this effort to kind of get away from leadership and to suggest that we're going to be less involved. And I think it's frustrating to some countries because they want to see more of what we've of our leadership, and they want to see more effort by the U.S. to care. And yet we seem to be withdrawing from leadership. We don't want the Chinese to assume leadership. We don't expect the Europeans to assume leadership. So I think a fair question of our policy right now is, what are we looking for? Do we want just sort of law of the jungle? Do we want no leadership? So I think that is a fair question. I think U.S. isolationism, and I think we're going through a bout of that right now. From the right, it's in the form of we're too good for the world, we're going to withdraw. From the left, it often is in the form of, hey, every time we're involved, we start wars, we make a mess, therefore, we're too bad for the world, we'll withdraw. And in fact, I think the world does need a much more engaged U.S. Diplomacy. And for Americans, I think we need to do a little better job of keeping military out of diplomacy and not sort of conflating the military with with our diplomats and trying to understand that it's not synonymous. So I think we do have a moment, I think, in our history where we need to give some serious thought to some of these problems. We need to be engaged. Some of us don't like it. I mean, I'm from Little Compton, Rhode Island, and no one in Little Compton ever woke up in the morning saying we need to dominate the world or be a hegemonic power in the world. Believe me. But I think the world is a better place when we're more engaged. And I'll end with the irony that many people, when they see us more engaged, they don't like what we're doing. And so, on the one hand, it's sort of like complaining about the old joke about it's sort of like complaining about the food at a restaurant, that it's no good, and then complaining that the helpings are too small. So I think if we're going to be involved, people need to understand that they're not always going to agree with how we're involved.
Great. I think I'm going to move just ahead a little bit here because a lot of the recent questions are talking about the press conference that Trump just finished just 15 or so minutes ago. That was on the topic of China. So I'll just read you both a quote from an NBC article with some of this breaking news. Trump blames the, quote, malfeasance of the Chinese government, end quote, for the spread of the coronavirus. He spread the blame to the WHO, the World Health Organization, as well. The US is terminating its relationship with the WHO and redirecting those funds to other public health needs, Trump said. China has, quote, total control of the World Health Organization, end quote, Trump said. He also announced his administration would suspend the entry of certain foreign nationals from China identified as security risks. So, do either of you have any thoughts on what just came as a product of his press conference?
Let me first on the WHO issue. This is an institution founded by the United States. In fact, the US has played a leadership role for WHO for so many years, and the US has contributed much more than all other countries together. In fact, 10 times, even last year, than China contributed. So when the Trump administration blamed China about over WHO, I think that's something very interesting. China has influenced, for sure, WHO much more than US. Why? Because China engaged WHO, tried to influence that. The Trump administration basically withdrawing from everything. You pay so much for WHO, but you did not care about what you want to get from them. You did not work with them. That's something totally strange for US, even for what he talked about the January 30th declaration of the global emergency, all those issues that China played a role. There are 190 countries, states are members. Even for the executive committee, the US, I heard, had more votes than China. I mean, those people, Americans in the committee has more votes than China. So I don't know how much China could buy the WHO. And when US withdraws from WHO, I think that's a big mistake, especially during this pandemic time. On the second part of the visa, he talked about to suspend all the visas from
some Chinese officials.
Yes, that's correct. The article doesn't specify, and I don't think Trump has particularly specified either, but he did say that there would be some following restrictions.
I don't know how many people will be affected, but in any case, I think Chinese students, Chinese scholars in the US, there are some people who have some problems for sure, but overall the benefits versus the harms, the benefits overwhelms the harms. The US has to go by case on those individuals instead of blanket ban people from China, which will hurt the relationship between, hurt the American interests too. American University, we have a lot of students from China. I just read last night from Cornell University. the university had a declaration that says the students from all over the world have contributed, including from mainland China, contributed to the scholarly environment, intellectual environment in the university. So for the intellectual, for the academic exchanges, I don't think that's the way to serve either's interests.
Well, quite apart from the issue of how many people have died from this pandemic, how many people have been within an inch of dying from this pandemic, we need to exercise to our efforts and get a vaccination. We need to have treatment. I understand blame games. I especially understand them during election years. To describe this issue as inappropriate in the middle of a pandemic is just way understated. And finally, I would say about the WHO, any people who've spent time in Africa, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Cameroon, Africa, all the morbidity issues of these underdeveloped countries. WHO plays an important role. Of course, you can argue they should play it better, they should do better things, but I'm afraid just pulling out of it in the middle of this catastrophe is just going to lead to more suffering. And so I expect more from the country.
I think we have time to tackle just about one more topic, and I think it should be Hong Kong. As I'm sure you both have heard, Pompeo notified Congress on Wednesday that Hong Kong is no longer deserving of the preferential trade and commercial status it has enjoyed in the US since reverting to Chinese rule. One of the questions in the chat is China's hardline approach to Hong Kong. Do you believe it's a result or a factor of the poor relationship between the US and China? And what can or should the US do now?
I'm going to turn that over to Professor Zhao to put on his policy and academic hat.
Okay, so I will try to be brief on this. I think one country, two systems were proposed by Deng Xiaoping during the China-British negotiation was a very good formula for Hong Kong. And when 1997, British government turned Hong Kong to China, people had a lot of confidence, a lot of hopes. Hong Kong will maintain its own political and economic system, will maintain the financial center in Asia. In fact, for quite a while, that worked really well. China left Hong Kong somehow alone. And during those years, Hong Kong's economy, Hong Kong's political status, everything went really well. I think the change started 2008, 2009. The Hong Kong people began to realize they were not appreciated by China. The Wenchuan earthquake, I heard, was a turning point because Hong Kong donated so much money, so many resources to China, but they found a lot of those money were not used well. And then since President Xi Jinping came to office, he became so ambitious to emphasize one country instead of two systems, to be clear that he's the ruler of whole China, Great China. He built, for example, Great Bay Area program, Hong Kong, Macau, Guangdong, all those areas, just treat Hong Kong more like a Chinese province and downplayed two systems. That caused a lot of problems among the Hong Kong elites. I would say elites, not those kind of tycoons, those kind of business people. They benefit from working with the Chinese government. Those small business people and liberal intellectuals, they find problem. In the process, there are some other issues came out. The house prices become so expensive, inequality, and the job market, everything. A lot of economic problems came up. So Hong Kong people became dissatisfied, unhappy, and also they found their freedoms. For example, a book center in Hong Kong, they published books on Xi Jinping's private life. Those people just lured into Shenzhen, and China were arrested. Even some people in Hong Kong were arrested. by the Chinese secret agents. So that caused a lot of uneasiness and problems in Hong Kong. And they tried to find excuses to express that. That excuse came last year when China tried to have the Patriot law, which is totally irrelevant. Just one triggered event, then start demonstration. These demonstrations became increasingly violent. I think that's the problem here. You could have a peaceful demonstrations to express your complaints, all the problems, but these have become so violent. So that gave also excuses for the Chinese side, government side, to use extreme force. But their hands were tightened because the Hong Kong Basic Law, which had Article 23, which is talking about national security, which has never been passed. And Chinese government had a lot of problems to use there. For example, Chinese state security forces could not be stationed in Hong Kong. So in that context, I don't know, certainly this last couple of weeks, the Chinese government decided to make law for Hong Kong. So this is the problem came up last couple of weeks. I think it caught a lot of people a surprise. And so that is the reactions from international community, including the US government, for the human rights issues, for Hong Kong's autonomous, all those concerns. I think those concerns are legitimate. But from Chinese side, I talked to friends in China, they thought Hong Kong is a sovereign part of the Chinese PRC, People's Republic. So as a sovereign government, we have all the authorities to maintain national security. So it's both sides. So here, the key issue is that then what? That's our Ambassador Hughes always asks a good question, then what? Would Hong Kong lose its financial center position in the world? Now people talk about New York, London. In Asia, basically has been Hong Kong. Now, do we talk about Hong Kong will losing that position if the US put all the sanctions? I don't know at this time. That's a big issue because the Hong Kong financial Chinese capitals already entered Hong Kong dramatically since last year to prepare for this. And the US now Congress passed law to delist Chinese companies from New York Stock Exchange. These companies will be listed in Hong Kong stock market to help Hong Kong stock market. And a lot of financial banks, I don't know if a lot of their shares, majority shares has been already held by the Chinese companies, Chinese government. So I don't know how this worked out. I'm watching and we have to see what will happen next.
But in answer to the question, I think the deterioration of US-China relations has caused a sort of, has had an effect on Beijing's attitudes to Hong Kong. And I think in the past, they might have handled it a little differently than the way they've kind of threatened it with this new law, which essentially kind of goes after any kind of anti-Chinese sentiment in Hong Kong. So you could arrest thousands of people under this law if you wanted to. So I kind of wonder whether China would have done that in the context of a kind of productive relationship. And then another question I have is, why did Pompeo feel he had to make this announcement? Was he thinking that by saying that we would take away Hong Kong's special status, that this would somehow slow the Chinese down in terms of imposing this essentially new legislation on Hong Kong? Did he think that was a way to get them to slow down? My advice to him was, it ain't going to work. It's a dog that's not going to hunt. And so maybe you should hold off and see whether we can deploy this issue of whether or not we keep Hong Kong's status based on some events that go on. So instead, I think he's moved way too fast and without really kind of seeing all the facts come in. Unless he had some information that the rest of us don't have, that by threatening to take away their status, somehow that would change Beijing's approach. I'm not sure it does, but maybe he had information to the effect that it would. But I really, it did not strike me as, often the best diplomacy is not the fastest diplomacy. It's a wise diplomacy where you're kind of calibrating your action with the understanding of what the other guy's action will be. And Steve's current team is, I don't think they calibrate anything on this. Again, I would go back to the question that we started with, how are we going to get back to a productive relationship with China? And these events on Hong Kong, these events on the pandemic, these events, frankly, on the trade issue, I didn't know that China was that far behind on the agricultural purchases. I knew they would never achieve that. I think it was 200 million, but I think Professor Zhao, you said 3 billion. Wow. So we are, I think, in kind of a mess with China, and I hope both countries can stop digging and try to figure out how we're going to get out of this hole.
I think let me follow this one sentence here. China side has been prepared for this, but this is the price I think they have calculated. They are willing to pay when they talk about sovereignty, national security. But I don't think U.S. side has been calculated. Planned this long game, even the short game. Then what?
Yeah.
That question has not been asked. Well, just the very typical Trump diplomacy, just one bite after another bite. If you get here, you got here. If not, going there. There's no strategic vision here. That's the problem here.
Give me if I could play chess and have 2 moves in a row without the other guy having a move in between, I'd probably win every chess game. And I think the problem is you have to contemplate what the other guy's move is going to be. And in these circumstances, it's never going to be helpful. So I really worry that there's a lost diplomatic art today.
Yeah, I'm very concerned in a very pessimistic note. We end this session really concerned. I'm very pessimistic at this time. Hopefully the election will produce something different.
Yeah. But, whoever it is, I think we as American citizens have a responsibility to be more engaged on these issues, more informed, and because I really think as a country, we need to do a lot better.
Yeah, I agree.